Chapter 4 is all about cell functions, and so throughout this course we're going to look at ways cells transport materials into and out of the cell, and we're going to also look at photosynthesis and cellular respiration, two major chemical reactions that cells are responsible for. So just as a refresher about cells, cells are the locations where all basic life processes occur, and these life processes keep the organisms alive. In order for most of these processes to occur, they require either oxygen, water, or glucose, or a combination of those three. So those are kind of what cells need, but what cells don't need is the waste products. And the main waste product is going to be carbon dioxide, and cells need to get rid of that. Other harmful substances must be kept out of the cell, and so remember, the cell membrane protects the cell. The cell membrane is kind of like this bubble over here, and it's that skin that is on the outside of the cell. So that thin skin of the cell membrane is made up of molecules, and they're mostly called phospholipids. And there are two layers, and we call the cell membrane selectively permeable because only some molecules can get through and some are left outside. So the cell membrane can select which molecules get to come in and which do not. This allows the cell to maintain homeostasis. So a little bit more about the structure of the cell membrane. It is a bilayer. The prefix bi means two, so that indicates to you that it is two layers. And you can see in the image we have a top layer and this bottom layer. And it is made up of hydrophobic or water-fearing or hating tails. And that would be the two sticks pointing down or up. And then also the water-loving heads. There's only one of those heads per phospholipid molecule. So different types of proteins are also found embedded in the lipid layers. Let's change that color so we can color code it with the picture. So proteins, and so here would be one of those proteins, or up here. These two are both also proteins. So those proteins are randomly distributed throughout the cell. They can help transport substances across that membrane, and so it's important to remember that water is found on both sides of the cell. So we call it the fluid outside of the cell. It's still water-based, as is the fluid inside the cell. And so that's why those hydrophilic heads have to be on the outside, because they like the water, whereas the tails do not. Small molecules can just slide right on through. They can sneak through those phospholipids, or they can go out of the cell. And they can just squeeze in between those phospholipids. However, bigger molecules, they would get stuck. They wouldn't fit through here, so they cannot just squeeze through the membrane. So that brings up transport. Transport is the passage of a substance through the cell membrane, and there are two types of transport. We have passive transport and active transport. Passive transport is when a substance can pass through the cell membrane without needing any energy, whereas active transport is when a substance moves across the membrane and it needs energy. And so you can look at the video here to show you the differences between active and passive transport. So Passive transport is when substances move from a high concentration to a low concentration. We call this a concentration gradient. And so the concentration is the amount of a substance in relation to the total volume. So let's say we have two containers, both the same size. And the first container, we'll call container A, has a concentration of, let's see, those 3 particles. Whereas in container B, we have a much higher concentration of particles. So one type of passive transport is called diffusion. And this is the movement of small molecules, so a keyword here is small molecules, from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. So in our diagram up here, the molecules would move from container B to container A because B has a high concentration of particles, whereas A has a low concentration. Simple diffusion is when a substance diffuses through the cell membrane without any help from any other molecules. So we're talking those small molecules can just slip past those phospholipids. So here's a diagram of simple diffusion. Here we're starting over here. And what we notice is that this side of the diagram, this outside, is the extracellular space. That means this is on the outside of the cell. And then we see our lipid bilayer. And then we have the inside. So this is the inside of the cell. And when we start, we'll notice that we have a high concentration outside of the cell. And so these particles are going to want to move into the cell. So as time moves on, so remember time is going on, and then we stop in here and we see that, yep, some of these particles have moved inside the cell. And they're just squeezing through these phospholipid molecules. So, and remember, in order for this to happen, these molecules must be very small. And the example of small molecules would be oxygen and carbon dioxide. So as time continues on, we can see that the concentration outside the cell from start to finish has decreased, where the concentration inside the cell started with nothing and has now increased. And at this last little snapshot of time here, what you should notice is that the number of particles outside the cell is roughly the same as the number of particles inside the cell. This is what we call equilibrium, because the concentration is equal on both sides of that cell membrane. Another type of passive transport is called facilitated diffusion. The word facilitated means helped. So this is when particles need help diffusing across that membrane. And the molecules that do that are the protein molecules, transport protein molecules. So facilitated diffusion is the type of diffusion that requires proteins to help larger molecules move across that cell membrane. So a transport protein is a protein that helps move hydrophilic molecules across the membrane, or it will help large molecules. There are 2 types of transport proteins. The first is a channel protein, and this will form a tiny hole or pore in the membrane, and it allows water or the hydrophilic molecules to get through that hydrophobic interior. So remember, we have this middle portion that's hydrophobic. So anything that likes water is not going to want to go in that region. And so we need those channel proteins to provide a barrier between that hydrophobic region and the hydrophilic molecules. Our second type of transport proteins are carrier proteins. These bind to the diffusing molecules, and it causes the carrier proteins to change shape. As it changes shape, it moves the molecules across the membrane, and generally larger molecules will diffuse this way. So here's a diagram showing you facilitated diffusion. Remember to look, our extracellular space tells us we're outside the cell. Intracellular space tells us we're inside the cell. And so this first one is a channel protein. What maybe didn't show up is that there's actually an open channel right here for these molecules to slide through. And this protein on this outside here, this protects those hydrophilic molecules, so these would be hydrophilic, from the hydrophobic region. Carrier proteins will actually change shape as a molecule enters them, and then so here's what it looks like when the molecule's in it, and then it kind of squirts it out on either the inside or the outside of the cell. So these transport proteins are just snuck in between the phospholipid layers. The last type of passive transport that we're going to talk about is osmosis, and this is a special type of diffusion just for water. Water can diffuse by simple diffusion, or it can move across that membrane by just squeezing past the phospholipids. However, it will go faster with the help of channel proteins, not carriers, sorry. And the water will move into or out of the cell by osmosis until an equilibrium is reached. Now, active transport. Active transport moves molecules from a low concentration to a high concentration, and this requires energy. So I always think of this as like going up a hill. So if you start low and you end up high, we all know that this, if we were to walk on that orange line, it would take energy. It would be a lot more work than if we started up high and went down the hill. So we would say that we wouldn't really input any energy here. So this energy comes from a molecule called ATP, and we're going to be talking a lot about ATP here in this next chapter. So what you need to know and remember is that energy comes from ATP. And ATP stands for adenosine, which is where we get our A, T, phosphate P. And this allows special transport proteins called pumps to move substances to areas of higher concentration. So these pumps literally move particles up the concentration gradient. And these proteins are found in the membrane, and they will pump the molecules across it. So one of the most common pumps is called the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump moves sodium ions out of the cell and potassium ions into the cell. So how it kind of works is we're inside the cell and we need 3 of these sodium ions, and they're going to bind to a carrier protein. That carrier protein is going to get some energy from an ATP. That energy is going to cause the carrier protein to change shape and causes this 3 sodium ions to be pumped out of the cell. Then on the outside of the cell are going to be 2 potassium ions just hanging out ready to come in the cell. So when those 3 sodium ions are pumped out, 2 potassium ions are going to come in and take the place of those 3 sodium ions. So here it is in a little bit of a diagram. So again, note, intracellular is inside, extracellular is outside. So the orange molecules are your sodium, and so notice how 2 of them go into that carrier protein. Then our ATP molecule right here, it attaches and gives some energy. This little yellow starburst is indicating that we're giving it energy, and it pops out those 2 sodium ions. And so now that this pump is open to the outside, 2 yellow potassium ions sneak into that pump and are released back into the cell. Our last type of active transport is called vesicle transport. And active transport brings in very large molecules into or out of the cell. And there are 2 types of vesicle transport. We have exocytosis and endocytosis. Vesicle transport called exocytosis. Exo means to exit. So this takes molecules out of the cell, whereas endo means in. And so endocytosis is when vesicles bring molecules into the cell. And what ends up happening with exocytosis is we have some vesicle that has pinched off from some organelle inside the cell, and it heads towards that cell membrane where it fuses with the cell membrane and then opens to the outside of the cell, releasing what was ever in the cell, usually some kind of waste. The reverse is endocytosis, when we have some particle that wants to get in the cell. It will fuse with the cell membrane, and the cell membrane will begin to pinch inwards and close off, and eventually becomes a vesicle on the inside, and that vesicle will bring that particle or molecule to where it needs to be in the cell. So there are a lot of different types of transport, so let's just try and organize these thoughts here. So we have cell transport. And cell transport can be divided into 2 categories. We can have active transport. Do that one in green. Or we could have passive. So passive is no energy. And active requires energy. Then, let's just focus on the active transport side. Active transport can be further divided into either pumps or vesicle transport. And so our example of the pumps was the sodium potassium pump. And then vesicle transport, we had 2 examples. We had endocytosis and exocytosis. Remember, endocytosis, things go in. Exocytosis, molecules go out. And both of these, whether it's pumps or vesicle transport, requires energy because we're going from low concentration to high concentration. Then let's review our passive transports, which require no energy. So we have diffusion, we have osmosis, and then lastly, we have facilitated diffusion. So diffusion is for small molecules. So like oxygen and water. Osmosis is only for water. And facilitated diffusion requires transport proteins. And remember, there are two types of transport proteins. We have channel and we have carrier. Carrier proteins change shape, while channel proteins form a pore or a hole. So hopefully this little table helps kind of organize the two different types of cell transport. And passive transport goes from high concentration to low concentration. That's for all of them. So hopefully this clears things up a little bit.